Hello, everyone. Hello, can you hear me? Is the mic working? I don't know. Okay, might just. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. No? No mic? Okay.
3 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Is that working? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate our new exhibition and catalog, Islam in Europe, around which this symposium has been arranged. At our gallery, our focus for over 30 years has been on exhibiting both European and Islamic artworks, but we have never looked at both together in one project in this way. In this exhibition, we are presenting Islamic and European art together for the first time, which is very exciting. And though the 60 objects included in our catalog date from the early 9th to the 17th centuries, they are all connected by an important thread: the continuous integration of Islamic artworks, technology, craft, designs, and culture into the European visual repertoire. I've been really lucky to lead on this project, but as you all know, Sam Fogg is the driving force behind this exhibition, which reflects over a decade of collecting and connoisseurship. And I'd also be remiss not to thank Michael Francis, who has assisted us in presenting 12 important historic carpets, and who you will be hearing from shortly. I'd of course like to thank Federica Gigante, Susanna Calvo-Capilla, and again, Michael Francis for being our speakers today. And unfortunately, Deborah Freeman won't be able to join us today, but we'll look forward to hearing from her another time. So without further ado, I'll just say a few words about Federica, who is a research assistant at the Khalili Research Center at the University of Oxford. Among other topics, she focuses on the collecting of Islamic artifacts in Europe, cross-cultural exchanges between the Islamic world and Europe, and astronomical instruments. She has acted as the curator of the collection from the Islamic world at the History of Science Museum in Oxford, and she has curated a number of exhibitions at the Ashmolean. Federica, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Diana. And thank you everyone for coming here today. I have the honor to open this symposium, and what I aim to do today is offering you an introduction to the topic of Islamic art in Europe, with a particular focus on Italy. And I will try to keep a balance between a bit of an overview of the topic in the first half of my talk, and then the second half of my talk will be more devoted to going into some lines of research that I'm developing at the moment and offering some new, I hope, views of the encounter between the Islamic world and Italy in the early modern time. Islamic art in Italy is found from the very early of times. And a classic example is, for example, rock crystals. These are Fatimid rock crystals with some Italian later mountings, and one is to be found in a treasure of St. Mark. The other one is in Florence. And these are normally believed to have made their way into Europe as containers more than anything else. Containers of relics, perhaps. Pilgrims going to the Holy Land would bring things back, and then they would keep the containers. And if you don't think this is a common phenomenon, that trust it, because this is me at the Jordan thinking, oh, I'll really bring back some water, and getting stuck with that plastic bottle ever since. So I wish it was a rock crystal, but same phenomenon there. You can find Islamic artifacts in all sorts of other contexts. And I'll sort of go a bit through some of the most obvious type of artifacts. The first one being textiles. And you can see here from this early 14th century triptych, a beautiful animal carpet. Textiles were easily transportable, weren't fragile at all, very easy to bring back. That's why you find quite a few when you really know where to look for. And this is another example from the 15th century. I particularly love it because we do have a fragment of an existing similar carpet, as you can see here. But you also find ceramics. Classic example and a bit of an odd one is the phenomenon of the bacini. And you see here on the facade of one of the churches in Pisa. If you look a bit closer, you see these bowls that are stuck on the facade. And when you look a bit closer still, you realize that some of them are actually from the Islamic world. And this is an example. Here is after it being restored, a Fatimid luster bowl. We know these were never meant to be used as decorations on buildings because they're decorated also on the back. But they are one of the survivals of such exchanges. And ceramic, you find it a bit ubiquitously, changing slightly in period, 15th century again. You can see it in the background of this John the Baptist birth, and something that is probably a luster Hispano-Moresque albarello. Glass was certainly also present, although for obvious reasons its survival is a bit rarer. But you can still capture it and notice it. For example, this relief from the Cathedral of Ferrara shows a presentation to the temple. When you look a bit closer, you see something that looks so distinctively like a mosque lamp, something like that. This is a glass mosque lamp, Mamluk, really recalling the same sort of shapes that you see in the relief. We have metalwork. Metalwork is also easily found in Italian settings, and some of the visual remains of this phenomenon can be found, for example, here. This is Carpaccio's Dream of St. Ursula. The interesting thing is this detail in front of what is likely a devotional image. And you can see a bucket that is such a distinctive Islamic shape. And there is such a Mamluk bucket with a water sprinkler that has been added to it currently in the Cathedral of Treviso. So this was a documented phenomenon. What I'd like to show you as well, however, is not only the physical presence of these items in the Italian peninsula, but also the mutual adaptations of shapes and decorative motifs. The classic example is candlesticks. Now, candlesticks were probably quite popular. We do find them quite a lot in Italian collections. However, they did have one issue: size. Now, this is a particularly big one, but they're really huge. They were made for a different type of context, not the domestic sort of Italian kind of context. Probably they were quite difficult to be used as candlesticks. Candles were not that big. And that led to a different phenomenon, and to that. Now, what you can see here is probably a very similar type of candlestick that's been adapted as a recipient. You can see it's been turned upside down, it's been tampered with, and it's clearly been used here in this Ercole de Roberti's gathering of the manna as a recipient. He's pouring the manna into it. And we even have material evidence of this phenomenon, because in European collections, you do find candlesticks without the top quite often. And you can imagine that they probably would have had some sort of stop to close that hole, and it would have been used upside down. Another phenomenon that I actually encountered is then you find things that are called inkwells. This one, for example, was collected in 17th century Bologna. The collection of Bologna is what I studied for my PhD, and there I found this so-called inkwell, which is nothing but the top of a candlestick. So you can sort of imagine that they would have taken them apart and reused them and recycled them according to different needs. And that led to another phenomenon, that is the adaptation of these artifacts to the Italian market from the part of Muslim craftsmen. What you see on the right-hand side is a much smaller candlestick. You are sure that it was made for the European market because it has a coat of arms. And Rachel Ward has studied these artifacts and noticed that the socket has two standard measures. So perhaps they were the measures of like Italian candles, very practically so. And this is a phenomenon that you see in many different respects. This candlestick has the coat of arms of an Italian family, but then you find this, blank coats of arms. And when you see blank coat of arms, it's really evidence that there was an understanding of a market that was looking for these things that would produce items with blank coat of arms to be then personalized later on. So it wasn't a commission, it was catering for a potential audience. You can even date it because this is a jousting shield. You can see the indentation on the left-hand side, which was very typical of the turn of the 16th century to accommodate the spear for jousting. Another phenomenon is that of the adaptation of forms and shapes. And what you see here is a typical Islamic bowl. It's curved, and that would have been used on a sort of carpet. I apologize, this is from Iran rather than, well, the bowl is Mamluk, but it's the same kind of concept. You probably would have used it on a textile. And once you put it on a textile, its rounded bottom creates no issues whatsoever. If you put it on a wooden table in Italy, that would be an issue. And that's when you start seeing phenomena like this, flat bottom bowls. And this example is from the famous Mahmoud al-Kurdi, who was a craftsman who produced much of the most wonderful metalwork that you find in Italian collections from that time. We know that this was made for the Italian market because there are signatures here. Interestingly, at the top, you have it in Arabic. At the bottom, you have it in the Latin script. Not translated, but transliterated. So it says Amal for the work of Mahmoudi, which is an interesting phenomenon because it implies that someone wouldn't have been able to read the Arabic script, but to understand the language. To conclude this part, I'd like to look at decorative motifs. And again, this is an example from Italy. It's a beautiful dish made in Venice. And you can see some sort of, maybe perhaps orientalizing motifs. But when you look and you look very closely, you realize that actually they have used very formal details. You can see here there's a sort of loop palmette, another simple palmette, and it's quite small, but the blue one is a half palmette. You see it also in other completely different settings. For example, this is one of my favorite ones, is a painting of St. Anthony by Alvise Vivarini. When you look a bit closer to the frame, immediately it might resemble something like a book binding. And then you look a bit closer, this is a Timori book binding. I apologize, it's in black and white, but it actually shows so much better. You can see the use of really formal motifs that are taken from these artifacts and reused. So now, having gone through a bit of an overview of the adaptation of the Islamic art that reached Italy from late medieval times to early modern times, I'd like to move a bit onto the social setting that really allowed for the increased collecting of these artworks in the Italian peninsula. It is from the late 15th century that you start seeing things like this, a quasi cabinet. You see a sort of collection at the back with some artifacts. You can see them here. I mean, one is the classic Hispano-Moresque luster albarello. One is a Manises vase. You can see an example here. And this phenomenon of the gathering of these items into more formal collections is something that you see happening throughout the 16th century. And the classic example is this. This is the Tribuna in Uffizi. By no means a public museum, as it wasn't open to the public, but it was a semi-private space. And we know from the catalogs of the Medici collection, for example, that there were some Islamic metalwork there and daggers. Some have survived. So we have perfume burners from the collections of Cosimo I and a Timurid tankard from the time of Ferdinando I, which interestingly is described in the early catalogs as having a lid and a handle, as you'd expect. And as we get into the late 16th century, the sort of geopolitical situation really changes. And you start seeing what are, very formal museums or cabinets of curiosity in this sort of style. Some of them certainly contain beautiful artifacts, major artworks. I'll show you here an example. This is from the collection of Ferdinando Cospi in Bologna, which was assembled throughout the 17th century by Cospi, who was a protege of the Medici. He actually grew up in Florence, so he knew very well the Medici collections. And you can find things such as that. Because unfortunately it's a bit tarnished, but this is a beautiful Mamluk ewer. And you can gather that that wouldn't have looked like that in origin. The spout, the double spout is actually a handle that's been turned the wrong way around. It would originally have joined the neck, which was taller, but somehow it was tampered with at a certain point. We know certainly before it entered the collection because of that. Which, by the way, I love because they represented it as a Baroque vase, while it's of a very different sort of stylistic domain. But one of the things that intrigued me the most when looking at these collections is not so much the beautiful Mamluk vases, which you have it here again, or even, as we saw earlier, some of the Spanish Manises vases. It's the smaller items that really intrigued me. And I'm talking about shoes, spoons, chains here, both, bags, or hats, for example. And this is very typical of these 17th century collections. You find these sort of trinkets everywhere you look. And it was really trying to answer the question of how did they get this kind of thing? That I started to look a bit deeper and dig deeper. Of course, there was a lot of trade between the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy at that time. However, when you look at the logs of ships coming in, for example, the port of Livorno, the cargoes would be mainly bales of wool, of cotton, bulk items, food, grains. You're not going to find shoes and similar such things. And it was in really looking for that and tracing some of the correspondence of these collectors that it kept on ending up in the ports of the western side of the Italian peninsula. And I'm talking about Naples, Rome, its port town of Civitavecchia, Livorno, and Genoa. And that's when you really start finding who potentially did make and sell these items. Let's start with Naples. Just pretty view of Naples, 17th century. You can always spot some Turks. However, I must say, caveat, some would have been Armenian, some Greeks, but turban men. What is interesting is to think about the fact that all these port towns had one thing in common. They hosted between the beginning of the 16th century and the end of the 17th century between 400 and 500,000 Muslim slaves. These were people that were imprisoned and enslaved as a result of the skirmishes occurring in the Mediterranean between North African and Ottoman forces and Italian. The Knights of the Order of St. Stephen in Florence in Tuscany, the Papal Galleys in Rome, the Habsburg powers that reigned over southern Italy. The Mediterranean was technically speaking at peace. The Habsburg and the Ottoman had signed a peace treaty in 1580, but that was this kind of proxy war and pirating activity. And I know it's really romantic to think of pirates, but pirates in a way were state-sponsored enterprises to go and annoy the enemy and gain some financial results and gain. As one Venetian ambassador put it, it doesn't do any damage, but it's like a mosquito, it really annoys the enemy. And it's really what you find by looking at the sources. They were constantly fighting each other and then taking prisoners either sides. Once these Muslims were imprisoned in Italy, in Italian ports, they would be put to row on board the very same galleys that then would go out at sea and fight the Ottomans. They would always have to strike a balance, because if you had more than half Turkish rowers on a boat that then fought the Ottomans, you risk mutiny, and that was a bit tricky. But as a matter of fact, these boats could only go out at sea during the summer. You couldn't navigate in winter. So you have got hundreds, if not thousands of men stuck in ports in Naples, Rome, Livorno, and Genoa, Messina as well, throughout the winter without anything to do. And it was costly for all the governments that had to maintain, they had to feed them. And that's why they were allowed to actually work and make things and open shops and sell. And that wasn't just being generous, it's because whatever they gained, they would give part of that to the galley commanders. And I'm going to read from some of the sources to really show you what the picture was. So in Naples, for example, in 1660, we have a petition that the inverted commas Turkish slaves, they were all Turks to the Italians, sent to the Pope. Quote, "Here in Naples, the past viceroy gave us, the slaves, 2 bottega, 2 shops in the castle, and there we could sell. Now they stop us from selling anything in the galleys." Unquote. Let's move to Civitavecchia then, the port of Rome, and sure enough, look closer, you find some Turks. In Civitavecchia, the papal galleys, one of the contemporary witnesses claims, and I quote, "The Turks improved their capital by making knitted, sewn, and tarsia works, and selling baskets, hats, belts, and similar things made in the Moorish manner. Alla moresca in Italian." Interestingly, the description fits exactly the sort of things I mentioned earlier and showed you earlier that I find in these collections: bags, hats, shoes, and belts. In 1614, Pantero Pantera, who was one of the captains of the papal galleys, wrote, and I quote, "There is no lack of men among the crew who work, making stocking, shirts, dice, toothpicks, and other such things, with which they obtain some money and help themselves greatly, supplementing their small provision of biscuit and water." Unquote. And as I said earlier, this was by no means just generous. It was to gain money. In Rome, they had to pay a weekly tax in order to be able to open such booths. And you can see some sort of examples here. This is a Dutch print, and what it shows, I believe this is actually Naples from sort of the layout. And you can see some turban men who are probably merchants. and some slaves that are sitting, probably making something. And you can recognize them because they have shaven heads and a top knot. And that was a way to recognize them should they run away. In Genoa, we find the same phenomenon. And the slaves were so much out of control that we have a decree from 1668 that, and I quote, mentions, "The slaves of our galleys go around selling tobacco and all sorts of things and merchandise subject to duties, not only in the dockland, but also around the city. And they maintain open stalls in the piazza, the river bank, and around the church of San Lorenzo, and in many other places in the city." Unquote. And you normally find out about this phenomenon that seemed to be common enough to just emerge when there was a problem. And the problem here was, well, they weren't paying tax, basically. And people complained why they had to pay duties and the Turks didn't, but also because they made a lot of noise around the church of San Lorenzo during Mass. We also know that they didn't only sell things, but also remedies. In 1598, a certain Bernardo Castellini wrote to the famous naturalist and collector Ulisse Aldrovandi from Genoa, saying, and I quote, "Here I have gathered information on this plant from several Moorish galley slaves, who told me that it purges the lower regions of the body well." Unquote. Very diplomatic way to describe what's going on here. An even more complex phenomenon and displays of shops and businesses, however, is found in Livorno. And again, spot the Turks here. This was a free port, so it was a bit of an exception in Italy. It allowed every single person from any nationality to set up position in Livorno. And in Livorno, the slaves were of the Medici Grand Duchy were free to go around during the day. Livorno in itself was a prison, so there wasn't really much of a risk of them running away. It was surrounded by the sea on one side and really tall walls on the rest of the city and closed doors. So there were very, very few accounts of people managing to escape. And we know from other sources of that time that those who did embark on the galleys in winter, or because they weren't selected for the task, the Livornese fleet was actually quite big, so it allowed for rotations. And we have witnesses that mention, I quote, "The majority of them during the day remains sitting and works. Some make tobacco pipes, some others make boxes, other socks, and various other objects," unquote. And that is interesting because when we look at some of the items that we see in these collections, like I showed you one before, but there are quite a few in Italy, we find, for example, in the Settala Museum, which was, again, a Medici-sponsored museum assembled in Milan by Manfredo Settala, and I quote, "A small ebony, or rather cane, a tobacco box for making and taking tobacco, worked by a Turk called Ali Krab, slave of Manfredo," unquote. So you can see that even when in a domestic setting, these enslaved individuals would actually make things for collections. And the way they sold them was literally by lining up the port side with shops. And we know that there were hundreds of them. Again, one of the witnesses of the time mentions, I quote, "Many of them rented out for 1 piece per month the stalls that were around their penal colony and the booths in the dockland. In there, they sold clothes, shoes, ironwork. The Turks go out freely the day around Livorno, enabling themselves to earn their daily bread by means of their aforementioned crafts and stores," unquote. So again, you can see that it was also a way to gain some sort of money for the administration. And some of them must have made so much and it probably were settled in their own business that remained even after being freed. And we have an example, a certain Mustafa Topal, who in Livorno was freed, but, quote, he maintained a coffee shop in Via San Giovanni. He's a free Turk, having received his passport. So what I hope I have managed to show you today is that when we look at these collections, what I showed earlier, not so much the beautiful Mamluk vase, but the small trinkets, the boxes, the shoes, the hats, the bags, spoons. Probably these were the things that were being produced in the Italian peninsula by these hundreds of Muslim enslaved galley rowers who were put to work and sell in Italy during the entirety of the 17th century. And what I hope is also to be able to show a bit of like recovering the story of these individuals that normally go completely unseen and forgotten in history, and sort of bring them back and show what they might have contributed in the history of the exchanges between the Islamic world and Europe.
Federica needs to leave promptly to get to another talk back in Oxford, but we have time for one question if anyone has a burning one.
Or two.
Or maybe two.
Thank you very much. Well, I would need another talk to answer that question, which is probably the foundation and the sort of probably what every Islamic art historian would start in any introduction course or when having a bit more time is the perennial question of what is Islamic art. And I'm using it here in a very broad sense. Actually, what I really wanted to show was precisely how inappropriate that is, especially art behind, because I'm showing you the minor things, you know, the shoes, the hats, how do you define it as art? I don't think there is any consensus of how to go about this issue and using other terms like Islamicate or not. Preferences, personal preferences. From my point of view, I always caveat that in any kind of publications or that my interest is really about, in general, material culture that comes either from the Islamic world or from people who come from the Islamic world. And that's why I often use the term Turk in inverted commas. That helps me because that's how my primary sources called them. I know they weren't Turks. As I said, many even Christians. But because they were just blanked out as Turks, the maximum that I can do is point out this much more diverse pool of people and say that, we cannot really go deeper into that. But yeah, it would be something to spend another hour to talk about.
You talked about the west side of Italy. Was a similar situation happening on the east side of Venice, downwards, or you don't?
Not as much. So that's quite interesting because I asked myself the very question, oh, it's all on the west side. The most obvious case is Venice, but Venice didn't have such a crew of enslaved Muslims for various reasons. Security reasons is always really not gone into that direction. In 1573, Venice signed a peace treaties with the Ottoman Empire forbidding mutual enslavement. So actually didn't have that many. Besides that, Venice had a system in place for the selling of Turkish sort of items in the Fondaco dei Turchi, had a really long-standing tradition of commerce. So never really saw the same phenomenon. It had already a lot in place to really avoid these pop-up shops, which I like to call pop-up shops because they were there during the winter and not the summer. The other obvious place probably is Ancona, but again, you don't see, they wouldn't have had a fleet of galleys. So it's typically Western Italy.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I know
And
you have to leave.
I'm sorry, and I'll try to connect online too.
Our next speaker is Susana Calvo Capilla. Susana is a professor in the Department of Art History at the Complutense University of Madrid. She has conducted research around the world from Cairo to Cambridge, Mass, and has extensively published on current issues in art history. She's led 2 important research projects on Al-Andalus, funded by the Spanish Ministry of Research. She's a personal hero to any who have devoted time to studying the arts and architecture of Islamic Spain. And she continues to make important contributions to understanding religious architecture and visual culture in the Mediterranean. I'm so delighted to introduce her to you all today.
Yes. Oh. Okay. So thank you very much, Diana, for the presentation and for the invitation to participate in this symposium. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. So, okay, I will reflect a little about the studies of Islamic art in Spain from the beginning of the history of art in the 19th century. So, okay. On the 19th of June 1859, José Amador de los Ríos entered the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid, giving a speech in which he proposed to define, I quote, that style which was held in little esteem or viewed with absolute contempt by ultra-classicist of the last century, and which today, not without historical and philosophical accuracy, begins to be called mudéjar, an art which has no equal or similar in other southern nations. End of quotation. A broader analysis of the evolution of the mudéjar style and its political connotations and utilities show that its significance goes beyond the local and can be better understood within the framework of the powerful nationalist and orientalist discourse that emerged in support of the European colonial policies in the 19th century. In my opinion, the application of the mudéjar style in Spain from the 1859 onwards has an interesting parallel with what happened in Egypt, for example, in the definition of the medieval Cairo by the European powers. The Orientalist scholars at the service of the colonizing empires were in charge of ordering the history of the administered territories and of cementing their national styles, destined to become the historical artistic references to the East for Europe. In other words, as Thomas Metcalfe has pointed out, to become a useful past that justified its control by a civilizing West. The definition of the mudéjar style, sealed by José Amador de los Ríos, and above all its success in the second half of the century, were linked to the need to redefine the contribution of the Islamic past to our national identity, and secondary, to react to the initial failure of Spanish colonial policy in Africa. We should remember that the first war with Morocco was less than a year and just began a few months after the speech in 1959. Unlike their French and English counterparts, Spanish Arabists understood that their contribution to Oriental studies could only be made at home, and they devoted themselves to recovering the history of Al-Andalus. Spanish Orientalism focused on our native Orient, as Bernabé López García has said. Let me briefly refer to what happened in Egypt in order to understand the context in which the definition of the mudéjar style was created. We are in a period, the 19th century, when as Enrique Michaud, among others, had recently argued, national essences were closely linked to race, genealogy, and religion. Mamluk architecture in Cairo was the subject of renewed and, one might say, unexpected interest in the second half of the 19th century. In 1881, the colonial powers promoted the Comité de Conservation des Monuments de l'Art Arabe, an institution controlled by European architects, Julius Franz Basha, Mars Herk, Ambroise Brody, although officially established by the Khedive Taufik Basha. The subject has been discussed by numerous specialists, such as Nasser Rabat, Mercedes Bollé, Paula Sanders, who revisited it in 2008, analyzing the British imperial context in which the committee was created and the development of the intellectual discourse that accompanied it, inspired by the previous colonial experiences. It was at this time that the notion of medieval Cairo was invented, whose Arab art, identified almost exclusively with Mamluk architecture, had to be preserved. They had two precedents, Sanders points out, that of the British Empire and that of the Ottoman Empire. The colonial powers' interest in preserving Arab art ended up identifying Cairo with a medieval city. This vision clashed with the Egyptian desire to progress, which Muhammad Ali put into practice by launching a major program to modernize the country in the religious, educational, and administrative spheres. Muhammad Ali urban plans for Cairo, which opened large avenues and boulevards in the old quarters, were described by the ideologues of colonial policy as pathetic and vulgar imitations of European cities, which had also destroyed medieval monuments. European powers saw Islam, and therefore Egypt, as incapable of reform. In fact, Muhammad Ali had chosen the Ottoman style for his great architectural projects, such as the Citadel Mosque that we saw here. The Citadel Mosque that replaced the Great Iwan, the Mamluk Great Iwan, the mosque was called Alabaster Mosque by the Europeans. He thus shows the very Ottoman art that was later banned and erased in many places by the Monuments Commission in favor of Mamluk art. When Great Britain and France took control of the country of Egypt, they became the protectors and guarantors of the preservation of several monuments that they considered to be abandoned, paralyzing urban and religious modernization, and disregarding institutions such as the Waqf system, which has been essential to the maintenance of these buildings over centuries. For the committee, this Oriental architecture was a visual representation of medieval Islam. The construction of the historical narrative combined a fictional Arabic literature, such as the British editions of Arabian Nights, and a version of medieval Cairo that was useful to them in their civilizing discourse. In doing so, they established themselves as the guardians of Egypt's past and the agents of necessary change. The most interesting thing is that the members of the committee choose Mamluk art to represent this national Arab and art of Egypt. And this choice was shared by the Egyptians, who saw this period of architectural splendor as a symbol of their individuality within Ottoman Empire and a way to rebel against it. It was paradoxical that the works promoted by the Mamluk sultans, who always insisted on their Turkish and not Egyptian origin, became their sign of identity. As a result, much of the architecture of the Khedives in the second half of the 19th century, both religious and civil, like the pavilions in the Western exhibitions, was built in the neo-Mamluk style, a new expression of their national art, as Nasser Rabat has studied. Even though Egypt was still far from being a nation state, which only has been achieved in 1952. In fact, the committee considered only the original state of the buildings as authentic. The later layers, like Ottoman additions, having disappeared. Its aim was to present European visitors with an immaculate image of medieval Cairo, even altering the inscriptions, like here, for example, in the Kalaun mausoleum, as studied by Dina Bahoun. That was something similar that happened in Spain with the plaster of the buildings, as we saw later. At the same time, here you see the changes. At the same time, in the 1880s, British theorists coined the concept of medieval Cairo as a synonym for its Islamic monuments, and in an Orientalist representation aimed at Western consumption, the success of which can still be seen today, guiding some of the patrimonial practices. The Orient was almost by definition medieval, and Cairo was, in European eyes, a medieval city. Medieval here mean not only not modern, but also the inability to be modern by one's own means, as Sanders said. The protection and restoration of medieval architecture became another colonial instrument and political issue. Moreover, the term medieval for Islamic art has become so entrenched in the history of art that it remains omnipresent today, even after its criticism by such eminent voices like Oleg Grabar and Edward Said. But let's return to Spain. The European Orientalist vision was present in the way some mid-century Arabists viewed Spain's Muslim past. Orientalism contributed significantly to the spread of cliches about Semitic inferiority, as studied by Eric Michaud and Juan Pablo Domínguez. Grace is everything: literature, science, art. In a word, civilization depends on it. Francisco Fernández y González, for example, spoke in 1861 of a contemporary Orient in political and cultural decline, of a Semitic race confronted by the rising genius of an Aryan and Indo-Germanic West. The West, however, had been able to forget all grudges and recognize the virtues of the Arab culture, science, and literature, which have contributed to the past, in the past, to the common work of civilization. A change was taking place. While those pioneering Arabists acknowledge those contributions of the Arabs to the Spanish and European culture, by the middle of the century, nuances were introduced. It was argued that Spanish national genius, Hispanic heritage, and the fertility of the peninsular lands had contributed decisively to the splendor of Spanish Arabs and Moors. Reinhard Dothy began his famous Histoire des musulmans d'Espagne in the same year, 1861, with this statement about the Arabs. Ils n'ont rien inventé, on leur doit aucune idée grande et féconde. You have the expression there. With the rise of the racial concept of nationalities in Europe, a further step was taken at the end of the 19th century, and Spanish historians undertook the de-Arabization of Al-Andalus. Arab Spain became Muslim Spain, and Arab art will become Hispano-Muslim, or I heard before, Hispano-Moresque art in the years of the dictatorship. They were Muslims, but of the Spanish race. From the 1880s, and especially after the establishment of the Protectorate of Morocco in 1912, Spanish Arabists clearly tried to join the colonialist or Africanist policy with the creation of the School of Arabic Studies in Granada, while philologists devoted themselves to the search for manuscripts and Arabic Hispanic sources in order to interpret Spain's Arab past. Art historians wondered how the presence of the Mohammedan race, the herd that professed the errors of the Quran, I quote José Amador de los Ríos, had left its mark on Spanish art, on the assumption that Islamic or Andalusi art could obviously not be considered part of the Spain Christian expression. The theoretical solution, following the trend of the schools of the European nations and the existing ethnic concept of nation, was the Christianization or nationalization of this Arab art through the invention of a Spanish style, the mudéjar. a style that emerged under the tolerance of the Christian kings as defined by Amador de los Ríos. In other words, mudéjar was a domestication, again an essay to order history to create a useful and secure historical past within the Western and Christian faith, in the Spanish case. However, as Antonio Urquizar points out, when the speech was republished in 1872, Amador de los Ríos made some changes with a nationalist overtone, which very well reflects how the term evolved to become a symbol of the artistic genius of the Spanish nation. This trend was confirmed by the choice of the neo-mudéjar style for the Spanish pavilions at the Universal Exhibitions of the decade. In 1873, the newly proclaimed First Republic chose a pavilion to be built in brick. 5 years later, in Paris, with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, Spain once again chose the mudéjar style, demonstrating to the world that there was an essentially Spanish style, and it was not an Arab one. Certainly, the Paris pavilion that we see here had a great deal of neo-Arabic fantasy, but given the confusion that promoted the definition of the new style, it could not be considered anything other than mudéjar in Spain. The pavilion, built by Ortiz de Villajos, was described as the mudéjar of art of Granada, Sevilla, Toledo, and Murcia. And José Emilio de Santos, who was the Spanish curator in the Universal Exhibition, defended the style chosen against the neo-Renaissance style of a pavilion before that date, saying that it was logical to choose our characteristic style, which is mudéjar. The concern about the choice of image for Spain in Europe is not surprising when one reads the words of a French author who wrote the guide to the exhibition. Hippolyte Gautier said that he did not know why Spain was represented by Arab architecture, c'est-à-dire par l'architecture d'un conquérant qui l'a longtemps asservi. At this point, it is worth recalling how in England, the Alhambresque mode, the Alhambresque revival, was and has been in vogue following the publication of the Book of Owen Jones in the 40s of the 18th century. Spain did not want to be identified with an art that was alien to the ideal of Spanish Catholicism and Aryan race. All this confirmed the political possibilities that Amador de los Ríos had envisaged for this style. The invention of the mudéjar style, accompanied by the writing of the history of the mudéjars and mozarabs, meant the submission of peninsular Islam to the moral superiority and tolerance of Christian kingdoms, thus creating a new historical past useful for the construction of the Spanish nation, an unbroken Christian identity throughout history, and the moral superiority of Christian rulers. For its part, what was truly Islamic art was either españolizado, made Spanish, and racialized, or seen as something exotic and alien, and therefore incapable of penetrating Hispanic and European art and culture beyond the superficial and epidermal. In 1919, For example, this book of Manuel Gómez Moreno, Iglesias Mozarabic Churches, Spanish Art from 9th to 11th centuries, he used the term Spanish in the title. Seems to have this term seems to have a rather exclusive character. The author admits that Christian art of the time was an offshoot of Cordovan art, but with a stamp of inventiveness that always gave it its own physiognomy. In the 1930s, the years of the Second Republic in Spain, Americo Castro offered a different vision of Spanish history. In 1948, from exile, he published Spain in its History, in which Muslims and Jews were seen as transcendental to the formation of Spanish character, forming its Semitic contextura in Spanish. Sánchez Albornoz, also in exile, railed against what he saw as a gloomy Semitic explanation of the history of Spain. Indeed, such a proposal, the proposal of Americo Castro, would take time to reach art history. Morocco, because of its proximity and because it was the only Spanish colony, along with Guinea, became the living reference of the Oriental in the study of Al-Andalus. The rest of the Mediterranean Islamic world was relegated to a secondary place. It is not surprising that as late as the 40s in the 20th century, Leopoldo Torres Balbás was still describing Andalusi cities with images and examples taken from Fez, Marrakech, etc. We dare say that the Orientalist discourse on peninsular Islamic art has not completely disappeared from contemporary society, largely due to the consequences of the nationalist interpretation of the Mudéjar, which continues to be useful today as a tourist attraction. For example, the term, the idea of the three cultures. However, the historiographical discourse of the Mudéjar has also consequences for the heritage, which have been well analyzed in several studies by my colleague Juan Carlos Ruiz Souza. For example, the invasive restoration of buildings in the 19th and 20th centuries, in which plaster and polychromies were removed to leave the bricks visible to accommodate them to the definition of Mudéjar style. We see here one of the churches in Toledo where the plaster had been removed in the 50s. And we see here another one where the plaster were removed, but with carefully to leave the original state of the polychromy of the walls of the church. But also happened in Aragon and in other places, just always to accommodate it to the Mudéjar style. Another example of the interventions carried out in the 19th century was in the court of the Alhambra, in the court of the lions, in order to accentuate its oriental exotic character, as we see here with the domes, the colored domes in the kiosks. It was Torres Balbás who, following the guidelines of modern restoration, the Athens Charter of 1931, dismantled the Orientalist domes and carried out the recovery of the Nasrid Palace between 1924 and 36, which had some consequences for him with the military coup in Granada. Other cases, you see here some of the interventions of Torres Balbás in the Alhambra. Other cases include the mosques, for example, in Puerto de Santa Maria, where the mihrab facade was replaced, restored with this kind of Orientalist idea. And more recently, the Mosque of Bab al-Mardoum, or Cristo de la Luz, where the hipped roof was replaced by a flat one with the same idea of bringing it closer to Near East models. But the detachment from Islamic art and the focus on mudéjar has also important consequences for the understanding of our diverse medieval heritage, which tends to be understood as compartmentalized and monolithic. Monumental kubbas, monumental kubbas, ornamental facades, muqarnas walls, are used in Castilian and Aragonese architecture, although sometimes in different artistic vocabularies or contexts. Paradoxically, these forms are not recognized as expressions of mudéjar or Islamic elements, as Rizouza has studied in the last 3 decades. Other consequences of Christianization of detachment where, for example, the Nasr art was considered to be fruit of the Hispano-Muslim genius, or, for example, the disinterest of an estrangement that Islamic objects aroused in Spain at the end of the 19th century. Here, for example, for this reason, collectors such as the Spanish Orientalist Mariano Fortuny and Juan Facundo Riaño, among many others, removed from Spain such outstanding pieces as the León de Monzón we see here, or the pieces of Almugira, chefs-d'œuvre that were a definitive loss for Spanish museums. Juan Facundo Riaño's role in the export of numerous works of art from Spain is particularly paradoxical and inexplicable, given the important role in the protection, cataloging, and promotion of Hispanic heritage he had. But also because Juan Facundo Riaño was one of the scholars who showed a real interest in the study of Islamic art of the peninsula. Taking up some of the arguments of Nasser Rabat's recent critique to the exhibition inspired by the East in the British Museum, it appears that in some Spanish archaeological museums, the Orientalist vision of our Islamic parts persists, with a selection and display of objects that either contribute to its alienation from our Western culture, or adapting or falsifying, that depends on the way we can express it, the past to our useful vision of history. This partial and exclusive discourse is also visible in some other Islamic exhibitions of Islamic art in the Occidental or Western museums. So we see here, for example, the new display of the Islamic collection in the Museo Arqueológico Nacional, in the National Archaeological Museum in Madrid, which also has some two old views about Islamic art. Nasser Rabat was alluding to what Roland Barthes called the reality effect, that is the placement of a series of objects designed to lend authenticity and plausibility. In the case of the London exhibition, to the scenes invented by the Orientalist painters, And in the case of the Spanish Museum, we can say a certain image of Al-Andalus. And this the the two last images. In Madinat al-Sahra, for example, the Roman sculptures and that decorate some of the courtyards are not displayed, nor in the museum. They are not visible neither in the ruins. So elements that will be difficult to interpret in Islamic architecture because they do not confirm the traditional vision of Islam that we have labeled medieval, namely a deeply religious world in which palaces were designed for opulence, sensuality, and ostentation, and these sculptures have no place in this kind of vision. So thank you very much.
I think we have time for one or two questions.
I don't have.
So what were the of the cultural appropriations or interventions or adaptations of the Arabs when they colonized Spain? So what were their colonizers stretches on Spain?
Do you mean in the in? Okay. I think they consider the pre-Islamic past of the peninsula as part of their history. So they begin, for example, the chronicles, which the accounts of the history of Al-Andalus. They began this history in the past, in the Greek times, in Roman times. They consider that the emperors of Rome and the kings, the Visigothic kings, were the ancestors of their power. So they also take all this heritage as part of their own heritage. No, I think they consider this part of they consider they were the heirs of this imperial past. So they assume as their own culture this kind of things. I don't see Orientalist vision there. Sorry.
Do we have any other questions?
Would you say that as historians, we are expected to use only the term Andalusi or Andalusia when we speak
Yeah. In Spain, we try to use this term because, yeah, as I said, Hispano-Árabe or Hispano-Musulman in Spanish, Hispano-Moresque or Hispano-Muslim. It's like, it's a nationalization of our Arab past. So we try to, because the name of this part of the Muslim world was called Al-Andalus. We try to use Andalusi for the culture, the literature, even the literature also they use now Andalusi Arab authors. So yeah, I think it's for me, it's a more correct way to call it.
just to piggyback off of them, would you say that that is an attempted erasure of the Arab aspect? And would you find that ironic considering that an ended comes from an Arabic word?
Sorry, the beginning of the question?
The answer to her question, I was wondering if you would consider that an erasure of the Arab presence.
The erasure of the
De-Arabization, was that attempt, like linguistically speaking, is it attempting to erase the Arab presence that was once there during the Muslim period? And if so, would you not find that ironic considering an ended comes from an Arabic word?
no, and I mean that's the vision in the 19th century, in the period of the dictature of Franco. They consider that we are not of Semitic origin, but of Aryan origin. So they try to consider the Muslims in Spain as people from Spain, not from Arab people or Berber people in North Africa. So they consider that Muslims in Spain were Spanish Muslims, and that's the way the de-Arabization was on this way. They naturally they speak Arabic, but they were Spanish of origin, of race origin. So that's a vision in the 19th and the part of the 20th century. Now, yeah, it's clearly Al-Andalus was part of the Muslim world, and the exchanges between the one way and the in the two ways, in the two directions, were actively present in the Muslim peninsula. So yeah, we were part of the Muslim world. Yeah. I don't know if I answer your question.
A little bit. So I think I was trying to understand what their logic was back then and if they were aware of the linguistic aspect. Because the de-Arabization.
Yeah, but de-Arabization meaning race, not a language. Okay?
I think we need to move on because of our time constraint in this room, but thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Michael Francis to you all. Michael is one of the most acclaimed textile experts in the world and has focused on studying, publishing, and dealing in the most significant historic carpets throughout his career. Among his many achievements, he opened and ran the Textile Gallery in London, founded the International Conference on Oriental Carpets, and curated the important Arts Council exhibition, The Eastern Carpet in the Western World. Michael helped to form the textile collection of the Emir of Qatar and later worked as director of special cultural projects at Qatar Museums. He's also the founder, owner, and current chairman of the textile journal Holly. He's now a research associate at the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin and the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. In addition to his many accolades and extensive publications, we are very pleased to add that he was the major contributor to the section on carpets published in our catalog. I'm very pleased to introduce Michael to you today. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. Thank you. I'm going to find my own. Go on. No, hold on a second. It didn't work because we didn't have the power plug in. We need the power. Where's the power? Where's the power line? It's up here. It's up here. He's taking it up. Just got to put it on. It's got to go in here. I can find it. Can't find the power spot. Now we're away. Okay. We should be away. Okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're going to be very patient. This is quite a long talk. We're talking about Ginetta and Genetino, right? The historical significance of a dowry gift commissioned in Genoa, probably in the 1530s, and woven in the Ottoman Empire. After these presentations, you can visit the remarkable exhibition at Sam Fogg's gallery. Select a beautiful work of art or two. You'll be spoilt for choice, and make an acquisition if you choose. After you take it home, the object will certainly give you immense pleasure for the rest of your life. This, though, should be just the beginning, as every work of art has much still to be uncovered. Who made it and where it was made, how it survived, who owned it, what experts have written about it. Your acquisition will open up windows into histories of which you may not have previously been unaware, and reveal so much more that you will be undoubtedly enrich your appreciation of the artwork. Conclusions on art. Oh, sorry. Okay. Right. Sorry. Let's see what else. Conclusions on art are often subjective. Facts intertwine, and often with unsubstantiated opinions. Stories from historical sources are selective and vary considerably according to the author. But this apparent dichotomy is also in itself immensely fascinating. I will relate today some fascinating stories surrounding two 16th century Anatolian carpet fragments, first published in 1901 and 1910. These arabesque field patterns, the arabesque field pattern is known as the Lotto design, probably woven concurrently on two looms side by side. At the time of their making, each had woven in a very particular blazon, combining two important Genovese families. From the 13th century, Genovese nobility established trading posts in ports around the Mediterranean and the Black Seas. In 1261, the Emperor of Nicaea granted them trading rights in the Crimea at the western end of the Silk Road, bringing silks and ceramics from China. Genoa built its fortune from trade. From Jaffa and Alexandria came myrrh, frankincense, and spices. From Antioch, silk woven in Gilan in Persia, the costliest wrapped with flattened gold or silver gilt. During the 14th century, the Ottomans expanded their domain, starting from a tiny Belgic in northwest Anatolia. They crossed into Europe. Are you on the right one? Yeah. The Mediterranean Sea was strongly competed between Genoa and Venice. The latter paid taxes to the Ottomans to fund their army and to expand their empire. The Ottoman army was enlisted from conquered domains, usually initially Turkmens from other Anatolian tribes, then Janissaries, Christian slaves, mostly from the Balkans and the Ukraine. By the middle of the 16th century, the Genovese trading posts were gradually lost. At this time, caravans transporting goods overland required protection from highwaymen. At sea, ships were in danger from the Ottoman pirates who plundered the ports surrounding the Mediterranean, taking all they could carry as well as thousands of Christian slaves to sell or to man their ships. Genoa had been under French domination for much of the period between 1490 and 1528. Francis I and later Henry II made treaties allowing Ottoman ships to harbour in French ports. In return, the French had hoped that for their support to capture Milan and Naples. In 1526, Louis II of Hungary and his 30,000 men were destroyed in 2 hours at the Battle of Mohács by 60,000 Ottomans led by the Suleiman the Magnificent. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was left to defend Europe, although for a brief spell the Ottomans turned their army east upon the Persians. From 1490, Andrea Doria, the Genovese privateer, sea captain, and condottiere, fought for the Pope, the French, Naples, or whoever paid him the best. He amassed a great fortune and constructed the magnificent Villa Principe in Faso, outside the city walls, as well as docks for his ships. Palazzo Principe was filled with magnificent tapestries, frescoes, and paintings. It was Andrea Doria's home, where the future of Europe was debated with many of the most important European rulers and nobility. In 1527, Andrea Doria was appointed by the Senate Admiral of the Genovese fleet. When France attempted to conquer Naples in 1528, Doria terminated his support for Francis I and joined with his great rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ruler of Germany, Austria, Spain, Netherlands, Burgundy, and Naples. Here we go. The Doria family had been merchants and ship owners for centuries. Trebizond on the Black Sea was a major trading post for goods from Asia, and in 1285 it was under the Mongols, who appointed Doria their European ambassador. In 1339, after a popular revolution in Genoa, the Dorias were excluded from public office, only returning to power in 1528 under Andrea Doria. In 1522, when Genoa was attacked by Habsburg Spain, Adamo Centurioni initially supported France. Gradually, though, Centurioni, one of the richest persons in Europe, realized that alignment with the Habsburg Charles V was better for Genoa, as his ships were continuously attacked by Ottoman pirates that threatened Genovese sea trade. Andrea Doria and Adamo Centurioni planned to rid Genoa completely of the French with the assistance of Charles V. Centurioni had become the primary banker to Charles. Thomas Kirk wrote that from 1520 to 1532, Genovese financiers loaned Charles V 1,826,673 ducats, representing 14% of all the loans made to the Habsburg monarchy in that period. In mid-1530, many of the old Genovese nobility wished to retain French support. They believed that through Francis I, they might keep their lucrative positions in public office. The nobility feared conceding power to the lesser nobility. Sorry, I'm on the wrong side. No, I'm not. Sorry. Bankers, privateers, and privateers. The ships were each owned individually by the nobility. Centurioni and Doria, both had many ships, wanted an independent and powerful Genovese navy supported by Spanish ships and that would ensure the safe and prosperous city. At this time, Barbarossa, right, was leader of the pirates. In 1462, Barbarossa's Ottoman father defeated the Genovese Gattilusio family that had ruled the Aegean island of Lesbos off the Anatolian coast since 1355. But Barbarossa was born on Lesbos, and in 1478 to a Greek Orthodox mother. As a young man, he went to sea, initially in the employ of the Mamluks. He plundered the Mediterranean islands and Italian coast, taking Christian slaves, then continuously raided Sicily, Naples, North Africa, and the ports of Spain. In 1533, he became governor of Algeria. In 1535, Suleiman the Magnificent appointed Barbarossa High Admiral of the Ottoman Empire. The pirates had lost their chief, although other pirates, Dragut, Salirez, Sinan, continued to seize Christian galleys and pillage the ports of Italy. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza in the Ionian Islands, Barbarossa won the greatest Ottoman naval victory, defeating the combined fleet of the Holy League, assembled by Pope Paul III. Here we go. We're on the right slide. Yes. We're not. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. In the spring of 1539, while Andrea Doria was with his fleet in Sicily, he heard that Turgut Reis, who was known as Dragut, the most ruthless Ottoman pirate, was devastating Liguria, taken 700 Christian prisoners, and had harbored in Corsica. Andrea instructed his heir and great-nephew, Ginatino, to attack Dragut. There you go, the battle's on. Right. The wind was against Ginatino, whose ships had to row for days with oars to reach Dragut. Accompanied by Giorgio Doria, Ginatino sent him with 6 galleys and a frigate to approach the Bay of Girolata from the front. Dragut sailed out with 9 galleys, leaving 2 to guard the inner harbour. Once Dragut's ships were outside the bay, Dragut became aware of Ginatino Doria had a further 15 galleys hiding behind the peninsula. Dragut attempted to escape by turning his ships around, but was too close to the Spanish galleries. Ginatino's galley scored a direct hit on the Ottoman flagship, which slowly sank. Ginatino freed all the Christian slaves and brought Dragut back to Genoa in chains. Returning to Genoa, he was the conquering hero. In 1890 and 1891, a pair of dowry carpet fragments made in Uşak region of Western Anatolia were rediscovered, each bearing the combined blazons of 2 important Genovese families. Their prior existence had not been publicly known. In 1890, Consul Bernhard Limburger of Leipzig acquired from Julius Böhler, a leading art dealer in Bavaria, a fragment of a carpet for 700 marks, equivalent today to around 14,000 euros. We have not discovered where Böhler acquired this carpet, which, apart from its great rarity, is of enormous significance to the attribution of Anatolian carpets. In 1905, the Böhler fragment had been inherited by Martina Limburger, who in 1910 loaned it to the Ausstellung for Meisterwerke Mohammedischen Kunst in Munich, the most important exhibition of Islamic art ever assembled. Zare Zari and his team of scholars presented 3,553 exhibits, including 229 historical carpets. Friedrich Zari was the director of the Museum of Islamic Art Berlin, and from 1905 to 1930, that was from 1905 to 1932. In the exhibition catalogue, he wrote knotted carpet, wool, corner fragment, stylized yellow vines on a blue and red ground, blue border, European coat of arms in the corner, Asia Minor, 16th to 17th century. Mrs. Limburger, Leipzig. So, in 1912, a magnificent 4-volume folio was produced illustrating some of the exhibits, including this carpet. Zari here wrote, a completely preserved carpet with the same pattern and a coat of arms is in the Silesian Museum of Decorative Arts and Antiquities in Breslau, which is Rockwell. Zari invited 2 heraldry experts, Professor Brockhaus and Dr. Lionel, to provide a list of possible families. Came up with Salù, Adorno, Cibo, Doria, and Centurioni. They could not determine who it was. The carpet in the Silesian Museum of Decorative Arts had been pieced together to make it appear to be complete. It had been sold to them by Professor Max Wislencius, an artist and tapestry designer, for 700 Reichsmarks on the 8th of June 1900. This fragment had probably belonged to Max's father, the artist Hermann Weslencius. I'm having problems here. Wislencius, who had died the previous year. It was transferred to the National Museum Breslau. In 1943, the carpet was moved for safekeeping to the museum repository in Henrico. In 1945, much of the collection in Henrico was stolen by the Soviet Red Guards. The carpet had disappeared, and today it could well be in a small Russian museum. We don't know. The Wenceslas carpet was recorded in 1902 as knotted carpet, Oriental, 16th, 17th century. Interesting and important because of the European coat of arms displayed. On the 18th of December 1934, Ernst Kühnel, then director of the Museum of Islamic Art Berlin, wrote to Heinrich Kohlhausen concerning the identification of the blazon to the families of Centurioni and Doria, although Kühnel may not have researched the dowry it had been made for. Consequently, he was unaware of the date of the carpet. In 1935, Kohlhausen, the director, wrote Anatolian knotted carpet, 16th, 17th century, with Genoese coat of arms. No? What are we on? I can't see where we are. Oh, wrong page. No, sorry, excuse me. Here we go. In 1922, A.F. Kendrick and C.E.C. Tattersall from the Victorian Albert Museum asked a colleague, A. Vanderput, to identify the shield, and he confirmed there was a shield of the arms of the Genovese families Centurioni and Doria impaled. Presently, just 5 Anatolian carpets are known with original European blazons. This pair of carpets, an arabesque design rug depicted in a painting once belonging to the Crespi family, a medallion Ushak carpet in Krakow, and possibly a similar example in Berlin, and a bird Ushak in Stockholm. There are at least 170 rugs with arabesque field designs that are depicted in Western paintings. This painting in the Duomo in Milan by Crespi is the only example that I know of an arabesque design rug with a blazon depicted in the painting. In 1981, John Mills noted that the blazon is painted as if it was made up of knots, suggesting that it was indeed part of the carpet and not simply painted in by the artist. Painted around 1610, Crespi may have been, the Crespi rug may have been new at the time, or perhaps inherited from a previous generations. Specific elements in this rug may be noted, such as the interlaced lines within the arabesque, the arabesque of the absence of an inner minor border. The primary border appears to be free floating upon the red field with no outlines. Such features are often seen on arabesque rugs attributed to earlier dates. This armorial carpet in Krakow has an Ushak medallion weave, right? An Ushak weave, Anatolian materials, and red dyed wool warps. It has often been misattributed by experts to having been made in Poland. Polish carpets have very different wool for the pile, and the foundation is usually hemp or linen. And an Ushak armorial carpet in Berlin also has been misattributed to Poland. The blazon is the most significant thing in this otherwise rather indifferent example. It is possible that the blazon may have been knotted in at a later date in order to enhance its value. The yellow dye in the blazon has very little variation and has a different shade of yellow to that seen in the rest of the carpet. A simple dye analysis of the color might resolve the matter. That is, unless the restorer employed old wool in this situation. So-called bird design carpets were made in the Ushak region and attributed to the 16th and 17th centuries. The bird carpet presented here is in the Museum for Mediterranean and East Asian Antiquities in Stockholm. The blazon of Johannes Andreas Prochnicki was woven in at the time of manufacture. He was appointed Archbishop of Lviv in 1614 and died in 1633. We know at least 8 Spanish carpets with Anatolian designs and European coats of arms. These are attributed to the 16th and 17th centuries. 4 carpets were made in England or Antwerp for the Duke of Buccleuch around 1585. One of these is a copy from a contemporaneous or earlier Anatolian arabesque design Ushak carpet. 3 have field designs copied from Ushak carpets with 8-lobed star designs, and these have a blazon of Montague Impaling Harrington, combining the, who were married in 1558. The arabesque field design is called the Lotto pattern, after the artist Lorenzo Lotto. More than 500 Anatolian rugs are known with the arabesque field designs. Every book on historical carpets illustrates at least one example. Right? The texts have, in part, derived from their attributions and dating from the writings of just 4 primary authors: Kurt Erdmann, Charles Grant Ellis, John Mills, and Stefano Ionescu are the primary authors who have written and studied rugs with arabesque designs. Their writings have to some degree been the basis for most of the subsequent authors. Studies, though, have advanced over the years, and some of their original conclusions may need to be re-examined. Erdmann suggested that the first depiction of an arabesque design carpet may have been in a circa 1460 miniature by the Netherlandish artist Bartolomeo van der Eyck, who worked in France, probably Burgundy. This artist may well have travelled to the south of France and to Naples, and with his stepfather. Several rugs appear in his paintings. It is possible that both of these rugs depicted here are European after Turkish originals. The arabesque design may have been assembled from older ornaments by a court artist, perhaps working in Bursa in the 1450s. The earliest examples may have been woven in the Balıkesir or Bergama regions. It is likely that the pattern may have been adopted a little later in the Uşak region. The design was to become extraordinarily popular and continue to be made for the next 2 centuries. The rug depicted by Girolamo da Libri in circa 1520 reveals much more about the origin of the design. The lines are perfectly interlaced. The primary border of the carpet in the painting is similar to rugs attributed to Bergama. The outer minor box S serif border, which you just see somewhere there, yes, right, is similar to that seen on the famous Marbi rug circa 1400 from the Bergama region of West Anatolia. Again, last glass of water time. In the rug depicted by Benedetto Carpaccio, painted in 1538, the closed interlaced Kufic primary border is a pattern that we tend to associate with small pattern Holbein carpets, generally attributed to the Bergama region circa 1450 to 1500. The closed Kufic border can be seen on some rugs from the Uşak region. However, far more examples survive from Uşak that have an open Kufic pattern that we will observe later. Bergama in West Anatolia against the coast of the Aegean Sea was in the Karasid Beylik between 1270 and 1360. It was then taken by the Ottomans. Bergama rugs may have been amongst the first to arrive in Europe. We see here an arabesque field design rug with a closed Kufic border from the Bergama region, first published by Wilhelm von Bode in 1901. The colors of the Bergama rug tend to be softer and less vibrant than those seen on Uşak carpets from the Uşak region. Adjacent is a 20th century Romanian copy of this rug. We see here another Bergama arabesque with an 8-pointed star border with hooks. As far as I know, I'm only aware of only this one Bergama example with this particular border, although the border appears in a number of examples from the Uşak region. The most famous example of a Bergama arabesque rug was depicted in a painting in the National Gallery in London by Lorenzo Lotto in 1547. The rug has a typical wide side selvage that we associate with the Bergama weavings and less saturated tones than we see in the rugs made from Uşak. The earliest image of an Uşak arabesque rug depicted in a Western painting is in the National Gallery, Washington, D.C., by the artist Sebastiano del Piombo in 1516. The pattern of the border pattern suggests that the rug had been probably made in the Uşak region. Piombo depicts the fringe with such extraordinary accuracy that we may assume that the pattern of the rug is likewise meticulously portrayed. It is unlikely that the rug was new when illustrated. The interlaced open Kufic border, might date from the second half of the 15th century. In the two paintings depicting arabesque rugs by Girolamo de Libri. Both are shown with such extraordinary accuracy that the artist certainly must have had both rugs in front of him when the artist was working, although it is unlikely that he owned such costly items, and these may well have belonged to whoever commissioned these paintings. The pattern of the outer minor border suggests that it may have been made in the Ushak region. The artist shows us that the weaver occasionally introduced white cotton for the pile in places, as well as softer ivory wool. Highlights in white cotton can be observed on a number of surviving rugs from the Ushak region. In this second painting by Lorenzo Lotto in Venice, the Ushak arabesque rug with open Kufic border hangs over the balcony, with a Damascus paramumlook is on one step behind. Both rugs were probably made in circa 1450 to 1500. The wide outer minor border and the narrow inner border are typical of Ushak arabesque rugs from this period, and as is the blue kilim and the side selvage. In 1981, John Mills recorded 82 rugs with arabesque field designs depicted in Western paintings, 15 before 1550, 3 with a rosette border, and we'll get onto that in a moment. Since then, several others have been added. Kurt Erdmann spent many years compiling Zur Formenwelt des Orientepisch, with hundreds of meticulous drawings by Hannah Erdmann. These showed many different levels of pattern within each carpet. The complete book remains unpublished. Erdmann was a major historian of Islamic art. His monumental work on Seljuk caravanserai remains today a major resource. In the study of repeating designs, though, it is essential to isolate the lowest common part of the pattern that then mirrors vertically, horizontally, or both. Erdmann and those that followed him in carpet studies, like Sharara Yetkin, for example, researched the overall design scheme, see below. Right? They did not consider the essence of the pattern by identifying the basic repeat that may reveal the possible origins of the ornament, you see here on the right. Illustrated here are Turkmen Kochenak border pattern. Okay? One is the border from the Bergamo Holbein carpet of West Anatolia, circa 1450-1500. The second one is the border from a Salor animal decoration from Turkmenistan, circa 1750 to 1800. And the third is a border from a fragmented rug from the Karamand Belyik, Central Anatolia, circa 1475 to 1525. This has a field design. This has a field design of repeating horizontal bands. Sorry, this rug on the right has a field design of repeating horizontal bands, right, called a ragged palmette design that may offer one of several clues that could reveal the origins of the arabesque design. If one compares the halved ornament in the lower part of the image, that's the first image you see there, right, on the left, with the ornament in the adjacent image in the center, that has a halved palmette with a curled leaf, and its feather-like back. There are some clear similarities. Right? This could suggest that the arabesque may have its origins in shamanistic creatures. Some creatures may be observed, such as a detail of the stylized sea creature shown upside down at the bottom here, right? Taken from the famous Karamand animal rug in the Vakıflar Museum in Istanbul. When the smallest part of the design is mirrored horizontally, we may observe a central tree with confronting creatures. Above are hooked bars that resemble a stylized bird. The symbol may be observed in many adjacent civilizations. Most Ottoman scholars see only floral forms. Nazan Ursula, former director of the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts in Istanbul, is amongst the most enlightened in carpet studies. In 1996, she wrote, shamanistic beliefs were still vividly alive among the Turkoman tribes. The rise in Ottoman power in Anatolia fostered a spread of Sunni orthodoxy and a corresponding attrition in traditional beliefs. By the end of the 15th century, human and animal figures had disappeared. I should add that these weavers, once firmly under the Ottomans, their patterns evolved into floral-like forms. Since 1910 and 1945, no carpet scholar had the opportunity to physically study these particular carpets. All they had were rather dark black and white photographs to view. When the Böhler carpet appeared in auction at Rip and Boswell in Wiesbaden in May 2021, it was accompanied by a superb high-resolution color image. It was only then possible to study an image with much more detail. This revealed the spectacular colors of the carpet and the fascinating elements within the border. In the 11th century, the Seljuk moved the Jermaean Turkoman tribes from East Anatolia to West Anatolia to be a buffer against the Byzantines. When the Seljuks were defeated in 1194, their own state was taken over by the Karaman, who were for the next 2 centuries were the most powerful of the Turkoman tribes. Between 1300 and 1327, the Jeremian under Yakub I was second only to the Karaman. Turkoman nomads in Anatolia, whilst being Muslim, retained within their art ancient shamanistic symbols as discussed. In 1980, in Turkoman Studies 1, I prepared the research for Robert Pinner's article on the animal tree and the great bird. When the Ottomans finally defeated most of the other Turkoman tribes, the Ottomans' strict adherence to the codes of Sunni Islam discouraged the use of shamanistic symbols, and these were adapted into floral forms. Between the cogwheel patterns, this is in the border here, between the cogwheel patterns may well be hidden, highly stylized mythical creatures. In the book Anatolian Tribal Rugs, the Orient Stars Collection, 1050 to 1750, published by Harley in 2021, on page 116 to 119, I write about these in a chapter, Fabulous Creature Borders. A similar border can be seen in a classical 4-lobed Ushak carpet from 1475 to 1525. We are aware of 3 rugs from Central Anatolian Karaman Belik with arabesque field designs. This example in the Museum of Turkish Islamic Arts in Istanbul is the most interesting, as it has the Fabulous Creatures pattern border. Many have described similar patterns as floral. I see overt traces of shamanistic symbols of the birds and creatures flanking trees, common to Turkoman carpets of Turkmenistan from the 19th century. Two things may be observed from the image of the rug depicted by Sebastiano del Piombo circa 1520 to 1530, of the poet Vittorio Colonna. The arabesque pattern is in blue, which is rare but not unknown on surviving rugs. The border pattern has an open cufic design that we tend to associate with the period 1475 to 1525. A fragmented example with a blue arabesque field design survives in the Victoria and Albert Museum, although this has the cogwheel border that has an 8-pointed star interior. Sorry, I must have some more water. In 1572, in the portrait of Lady Margaret, no, we're not there, we should move on. In 1572, in the portrait of Lady Margaret Douglas, grandmother of James IV of Scotland, one can clearly observe in the arabesque rug is a simplified and somewhat crude version of the cogwheel border that we can see depicted in a painting in the Royal Collection Trust, where this painting is. The carpet may have been old when depicted. There is possibility that it may have belonged to King Henry VIII, who died in 1547. It was not until 1580 that the English Levant Company were granted the right to trade with the Ottomans, suggesting that it may have come to England possibly through Venice. The same cogwheel border pattern can be seen in other arabesque rugs. The border can be seen on Ushak carpets with different field designs. Stefano UNESCO has identified 8 primary variations in the cogwheel border pattern. These will be presented in his forthcoming book in 2024. The forgers of the Centurioni and Doria carpets. You can fool some of the people some of the time. You can fool some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. All right, I think he did that, fool all the people all the time. Theodore Tuduk's workshop employed mostly Armenian weavers, manufacturing copies between 1922 and 1939. He had a workshop in Satlung in the region of Brasov. The sales catalogue, Antique Orientepisch aus Siebenberger, was published in 2 editions between 1925 and 1939, written under the pseudonym Professor Dr. Otto Ernst. In 1933, the Victoria and Albert Museum purchased a Tuduk Chintamani design carpet, believing it to be a 16th century original. The weaver had inserted a pretend restoration into one corner. There are numerous variations in the weave of Tuduk carpets. Most of the rugs use Romanian wool that has very little lanolin in it. Few of his rugs have weft reversing lazy lines seen on most early Anatolian rugs. And those that do, this is woven incorrectly. In many of the colors, we see a consistency of the shade, as many are made with synthetic dyes. In 1984, Gallery Neris in Berlin published a Tuduk carpet in Harley and wrote, "Woven in the tradition of a 16th century or 17th century Ushak carpet, Eastern Europe." This example, again, certainly a copy from circa 1920 to 1940, although without examining it, one cannot attribute it to any workshop. Here the weaver chose to use the Doria coat of arms by itself. The weaver was probably unaware of the specific yellow-white background required. Kehaioglu was a student of Theodore Tuduk and set up a studio in Athens. Most of his Tuduk carpets use some synthetic chrome dyes manufactured in Europe, mostly German or Basel, post-1870. These can be seen in the yellow dye that has a uniform hue throughout and the entire rug, and may be detected using thin layer chromatography. Kayahoglu created this arabesque rug in Athens and incorporated the blazon from the original 17th century Ushak carpet that we saw earlier from Stockholm. These two rugs were catalogued recently as West Anatolian 16th century small pattern Holbein. That's the rug on the left. And the 17th century Lotto rug. Only 4 originals of the Holbein rug, circa 1450 to 1500, have this border pattern. The discovery of an unknown example with this border pattern and in pristine condition is equivalent to finding an unknown Vermeer. Their experts should have been aware of this. It is probable that both the Holbein design rug and the arabesque design rug were both made by the same weaver in a workshop in Konya that created forgeries between 1990 and 2010. The workshop uses naturally dyed wool unraveled from old kilims. Thus, the age might only be detected using carbon-14 analysis. To reveal in print an opinion as to authenticity or age in the absence of personal inspection of any artwork, or the blind repetition of ideas based upon the writings of others, or the opinions formed from the examination of photographic images alone, could be considered somewhat rash, foolhardy at best. Such opinions rarely stand the test of time and tend to skewer serious scholarship. They also reflect upon the author's judgments in general, suggesting many other of their conclusions should well be questioned. As Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, insensibly one begins to twist the facts to suit the theories instead of the theories to suit the facts. This reflects much of carpet scholarship today, as it also sadly rife in art history writing in general. Can't see where we are. Here we go. The carpet experts, many of whom worked from photographs or the opinions of others, all misattributed the 20th century Romanian carpets with the Cercioroni and Doria blazon to the 17th century. Whilst identifying the blazon correctly, surprisingly, none of these experts are believed to have sought the actual date of the wedding. This is a list of publications of the 20th century of the carpets attributed to the 17th century. Sadly, these are all some of the standard works on carpets that need revision. Examples of 20th century copies of Cedric carpets with Cufic borders. There's 2, and then we go to 2, we go more, and then we go to these ones. Oh, we on this is a cloud band border, I think, at this point. And here we go. This is the one with the wheel border, which we're going to talk about. And here we go. This one here. And Theodor Toduk reportedly told Nazaret Kazian, an Armenian carpet maker, not to make too many fakes in the same design, otherwise people might get suspicious. So that was funny. So, the page here. These images give an impression of the sedentary fragment when the carpet was complete. We are by no means certain of which marriage this was between the Centurioni and Doria families, because there are at least 35 marriages between these two important families. 6 may be discounted as being too early, 4 as being too late. For 12 couples, we have not yet discovered their dates, leaving 8 possibilities. Genatino and Gianetto appear to be the most likely recipients of these beautiful carpets. Laura Stango, an eminent Genovese historian, wrote, there is no certainty about the right marriage, though no other contenders had the status, wealth, and connections. However, in this case, this case is far from proven. From From around 1081, the Seljuk Turkomans have been the principal rulers of Anatolia. The other Turkoman tribes paid homage to them following their defeat in 1241 by the Ilkhanid Mongols of Persia. Turkoman tribal chiefs gained greater control of the individual beyliks. The Ushak region is situated in the southwest of the beylik of Jeremind. Kutaya as was its capital. We're on, here we go. Anatolian rugs were predominantly made for the home use by the nomadic Turkomans of the Uruk tribes, nomadic Turkomans and Uruk tribes, specifically for the dowry of daughters for furnishing new homes. During the lifetime of that new family, they did not walk on the rugs with outside shoes. Smaller rugs hung over the tent doors. Thus, often they survived in almost pristine condition. When the husband passed, the eldest son may have sold his parents' carpets or gifted them to a mosque. In 1671, Celebi commented on Ushak at the time. Newly arrived Turkomans had arrived from the east. It's a kind of entrepot where camel caravans and wagons from all over the province of Anatolia come and go. Though quite a small town, it's extremely prosperous and well built, since the neighboring areas are very prosperous and developed. The bazaar of this great center of the commerce are extremely crowded. Of the various crafts in this town, carpet making is the most famous. To assess the time taken for the original order in Genoa to delivery of the carpet, some 2,300 kilometers by sea and then a further 250 kilometers by land, one should consider that it would have taken some months for the two Turkoman families living side by side in tents would have had to gather the materials, spin and dye the wool, and set up the looms. Each loom, with 3 persons sitting side by side, these carpets must have taken a year to weave and some months to finish. Carpets needed to be carried by the safest route. Caravanserai, situated some 30 to 40 kilometers apart, a day's ride, were essential as fortified overnight resting places for the transportation of goods. The vast majority of these were constructed by the Seljuk Turks, although further caravanserai were built in the 16th century by the Ottomans. The nearest port to the Ushak region were to the west, beyond the territory of the Seljuks. In the 16th century, between Ushak and Manisa, 160 kilometers apart, there may have been only 2 caravanserai, thus making this route dangerous for camel trains. Manisa and Smyrna, some 40 kilometers, were both then fortified cities. Thus, the weaving families may have had to carry the carpets from Ushak to where these could be shipped to Europe. Unless documents are found, we will never know who could have negotiated Adamo Centurioni's order, although there are some possibilities to consider. In 1492, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II, in response to the expulsion of all the Jews from Spain by Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabel I of Castile, sent out a proclamation throughout the empire that the refugees were to be welcomed. Sephardic Jews received permission to settle in the Ottoman Empire and became Ottoman citizens. Sultan Bayezid II sent the Ottoman Navy to collect the refugees that were settling in the Mediterranean port cities, including Smyrna. Other Sephardi arrived in Venice and Genoa, and as such, through cousins, a major trading network was built up around the Mediterranean. Thus, the banker, Adamo Cetroni, may have dealt with Jewish bankers in Genoa who could well have had relatives in Smyrna, right, to arrange the order. It may have been that Adamo Cetroni ordered the carpets through the Genovese Giustini family. In the first part of the 15th century, 4 islands were under Genovese control: Lemnos, Lesvos, Samos, and Chios. that was just 10 kilometers from the Anatolian mainland and 100 kilometers from Smyrna. The Gustini controlled Chios until 1566. Whereas used carpets were readily available, the process of commissioning a bespoke carpet in these times may have been complex. If we assume that Adamo had ordered them, he would have had to advance funds through a trusted agent and then wait more than 2 years for delivery. One small clue survives on both carpets that suggests that these carpets may well have been almost completed when the order initially arrived. In the upper part of each carpet, with less than 20% still to weave, the inner minor border was narrowed to accommodate the blazons on both carpets. Thus, they could have been completed in just 3 months. I think you can see the narrowing on both those images. In the years between 1520 and 1540 were complex in Genoa. Many of the nobility had aligned with the French, initially with the approval of Andreas Doria and Adamo Centurioni. However, by 1525, Genovese trade was greatly reduced due to the Ottoman treaties with France and Venice, and piracy. In 1528, Doria and Centurioni joined with Emperor Charles V to defend Europe against the Ottomans. Thus, some of the Genovese nobility wished to prevent the marriage of Genetta and Genetino. In 1853, Emmanuel Silesia told a very different story. He wrote that Gianluigi Fresci, as the hero of Genova, who was initially betrothed to Genetina Centurioni, though 7 years his junior. Adamo told his friend Andrea of the betrothal, who suggested that Genetta should marry Andrea Doria's grandnephew, Genetino, who would inherit all his estate. Genetta married Genetino in 1537. Gianluigi, at the tender age of 14, reportedly felt slighted. Silesia wrote that Genetino was a ship hand, unworthy of Genetta, the most beautiful young lady in Genoa. No image survives of Genetta, who reportedly was in every maidenly grace unrivaled. On the 15th of September, 1542, or the 30th of January, 1543, we're not sure of this, Gianluigi Fresci, Count of Lavanga in Carrara, married Leonora Cao, Princess of Caio, and lived in the Palazzo Violata. Leonora's aunt, Catherine Caibo, Duchess of Camerino, was related to the Catherine de' Medici, giving the family strong ties to France. Gianluigi had been the elder son of Simbolo Fresci, who died when he was 10. Gianluigi, right? We're on the wrong picture, it doesn't matter. Are we? I can't know. Gianluigi was in debt, although he lived like a prince. He had inherited 33 dilapidated castles and villas scattered over the Apennines. Gianluigi's mother, Mario Grassi del Rovera, was the niece of the Pope Julius II. Gianluigi Fresci was driven to seek revenge upon the Dorias. The encyclopedia, where have we gone? We've gone too far. We've gone too far. Anyway, the Encyclopedia Britannica notes that Genetta Doria had started a love affair with Leonora Fresci soon after she was married. Other authors note that Genetino may have flirted with Leonora in 1542 while sailing them both from Nice to Genoa. The feud was said to have aggravated by suspicions of the affair. Gianluigi Fresci was encouraged by Francis I and Pier Luigi Farnese, the Duke of Parma, to conspire against the Dorias. In 1547, the 24-year-old Gianluigi Fresci was determined to get revenge. He secretly met with many of the Genovese nobility and proposed to rid the city of Spain, the privateers, businessmen, merchants, and bankers, and to reinstate the power of the aristocracy and ultimately its allegiance to France. As an appointed firing of the cannon on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of January 1547, Fresci's militia and Faranese's men entered the city gates. The conspirators then moved to the docks to capture Doria's ships and free the Muslim slaves. Andrea Doria, no, we've lost a bit. It's gone. Anyway, we've lost a bit. Here you are. Give them what it says. Fine, okay, we can go on to here. Genetino, also at Villa Faso, was woken by gunfire. He hastened to the nearby gate of San Tommaso, where, unaware of the occupied by the rebels, one of the conspirators, the notorious Agostino Biglietto of Bargia, aimed his arquebus and killed Genetino with one shot. Gianluigi Fresci rushed to the Admiral Doria's ships to release the Muslim slaves. Running across the gangplank in his heavy armor, fell into the water and drowned. With Fresci dead and the conspirators collapsed, Biglietti escaped. Andrea Doria personally saw to it that all the noblemen who had supported Fresci were banished and lost their lands. Genetino's eldest son, Giovanni Andrea Doria, was just 7 years old when his father had been murdered. After 20 years, he inherited his late father's estate. Andrea Doria is portrayed passing the Doria throne onto his heir. And I think we're going to end it there. We've got more to do, but I think that's time to terminate.
Thank you, Michael. We're being booted out of the room.